Here's a question that defies all logic. Can a band have more than one final album? The more I think about it, the more the answer seems to be yes. At this point, there clearly won't be another Pantera album, but their early and later music could be considered different enough for power metal to be their first last album. While Alice in Chains may still be around, their self-titled album now has some finality to it since Lane Staley's death was a huge deal and so much time passed until the next album. While no artist's output can go on forever, that might be hard to believe when you look at Jandek's catalog. There's no telling when the Corwood representative will pass on, but when he does, there may still be more material in the vault than we ever imagined. However, I think he has unintentionally mastered the art of the false final album, and there's no better proof of that than 1992's Lost Cause. In the Jandek library, it's one of the rare instances when the album title is derived from a song title rather than just a lyric. With an artist like Jandek, we can't be sure why that particular song was chosen, but if I recall correctly, its themes include nihilism and futility. Therefore, it's possible that Jandek thought he was going nowhere in his career, so at least for a little while, this might have been intended to be the final record. However, as we'll discuss later, the last track may offer a different explanation. As much as some like to call this the electric era, Lost Cause is actually the most acoustic album since Blue Corpse. Only 2 of the 8 tracks have electric guitar, but one of those is longer than all the acoustic songs combined, so the album actually has a fairly even split. Stylistically, there's quite a bit to discuss. The electric songs each do their own thing, and their positions in the track list suggest they were previously unrelated. Meanwhile, there are 4 acoustic songs that kind of remind me of Blue Corpse, at least in terms of vocals. If that would have been Jandek's debut record, I could imagine these tracks being the follow-up. I'm guessing that's still Eddie on guitar, but you can tell he had been trying some different chords in the past 5 years. Later in the album, you also have 2 atonal songs for good measure. My friend thinks they foreshadowed the next era, although they sound more like side 2 of Interstellar Discussion. Historically, Green and Yellow has always been my favorite track, although it was not one of the few I initially heard on YouTube. I always thought it kind of stood out, and I'm just now realizing that it's more in line with the previous record than anything else on Lost Cause. Played in a staccato style, it's nothing but the same G-sharp minor and F-sharp chords over and over, except for a slight variation towards the end. The result sounds like a never-ending verse from a conventional rock song, and it makes for an interesting atmosphere that reminds me of being home alone at night. Jandek sings about his difficulty interpreting things and people in the outside world, so I guess that's why he quote-unquote could not practice art. He sails the 7 seas to sing about this, possibly referring to the Jandek project, and the voyage is quite challenging. In the second half, the lyrics instead focus on his future lover, whom he is determined to satisfy. I probably wouldn't look for a lover in an alley, but I guess that's why I'm not Jandek. All in all, it's another effective opening track, but to be honest, I have no idea why it hasn't been covered yet. It's easy to play, and there must be lots of ways to spice it up. However, it's followed by something that's been covered at least 3 times. Because it's quite lively for Jandek, Babe, I Love You is perhaps the best-known song on the album, and it's guaranteed to make you sway or tap your foot a bit. On acoustic guitar, it's just a quick shuffling rhythm, mostly in A, although it becomes a blues progression a few times later on. This causes some anticipation that makes the song a fun variation on the typical Jandek blues. Unfortunately, I find it slightly overrated since the lyrics don't do much for me. They are mostly a bunch of short phrases, the common thread obviously being Jandek's love for somebody, except for when he sneaks in a bit of proselytizing. Not to mention, the word genitals is brought back since it sounded so great on Somebody in the Snow. This is certainly not a track I ever skip when listening to the album, and I do see why people like to cover it, but I still find myself listening to those versions more. You rarely hear about these next two songs, but I'd like to change that. Short but sweet, Cellar is a variant on the lyrics of Alehouse Blues from One Foot in the North. Instead of a flashback, this depicts the moment in the titular cellar when Jandek heard about Randy's death. Besides the cellar part, all we find out is that there's no mention of the tragedy in the local newspaper, which may speak to the severity of the crime Randy committed. On guitar, this time we have a 12-bar blues in C. And it's another song that blurs the line between rhythm and lead. Honestly, it might even sound better on bass, but in its current state, it's a solid addition to the song it's based on. Meanwhile, How Many Places is the track that's just starting to grow on me. It starts out nicely with those haunting vocals before turning into a melancholy folk song in C minor. For me, what makes it memorable is that repeating guitar fill. So the song already has a couple things going for it before we even talk about lyrics. They address somebody who moves around a lot, yet he keeps meeting people like him or resembling him. Apparently, he was stripped of his pride at one point, which probably has to do with his current situation. Very relatable. But then we get some classic Jandek when he says, "Go write on the wall, I will not talk in class," 50 times. Either he meant to say write on the chalkboard, or it's more of Jandek's strange humor. The remaining lyrics also might be about school, but what is clear is that this character just wanted to be liked. Overall, it's an underrated track that sounds great on guitar, while both Jandek's voice and the lyrics complete the mood of the whole thing. Crack a Smile is a more well-known song, partially because of the superb cover by Jeff Tweedy. I'm not sure which covers are the most popular among fans, but back in the day, I seem to remember hearing about that one the most. The reason I call it superb is that it's an improvement on the original, which starts out pretty well, but doesn't follow through. Played at the same tempo as Cellar, the main guitar chords are E flat, G minor, and C minor, and the addition of G minor almost acts as a chorus. This progression is what defines the song, and it rivals others from albums like Blue Corpse and On the Way. Unfortunately, the guitarist just gives up for the last minute of this track, and once again, you can even hear him tuning. This part has always been the reason I prefer the Jeff Tweedy version, which sounds much more complete. As for lyrics, they're mostly notable for bringing back Jandek's fortune concept. I don't know what a Sunday fortune is, but fortune frowning on a bad heart is more easy to visualize. Also, the song If Your Fortune Fails You is referenced twice. Otherwise, the lyrics take a back seat to Jandek's quiet howling, so it kind of acts as a second instrument. Anyway, as long as you move on when the chord progression stops, the original Crack a Smile is certainly worthwhile. Then we have the two dissonant songs. While I don't listen to them much, some say they were a sign of things to come. The strumming is pretty aggressive on God Came Between Us, especially in the ending. This is mostly another song about the man upstairs, who not only brought us things like the sun and the planets, but also lit our hearts on fire and put them out with oceans. That right there is such a great line that it was reused on a later record. Meanwhile, I Love You Now It's True is more about Jesus, except for the intro where he mentions the Tower of Babel for some reason. As a whole, I find it rather forgettable. Thankfully, for better or worse, the electric end makes quite an impression. As the grand finale, it brings the second era to a clear-cut conclusion, unlike the final tracks of the first era. Now, what does that tell us about the title? Well, let's examine the nature of this song. At first glance, it appears to be a long, continuous jam centered on electric guitar and drums. While the live albums suggest it's not unlike Jandek to do that, there was actually quite a bit of splicing involved, as evidenced by the differing tape speeds. According to my friend, there are several guitar tracks, and at least two for drums, so it looks like the electric end is just a massive Frankensong. Our best explanation for the title is that Jandek was gathering the final bits and pieces from earlier sessions so that he could move on to a new phase in his career. I commend him for using all parts of the buffalo, but how does this kill play out? Well, let's just call this track an acquired taste. First of all, the guitar sound is absolutely piercing, even compared to earlier albums. It's just a sea of dissonance, although something conventional does come up for air once in a while. Not to mention, there's a huge racket coming from some kind of whistle, and it's not just a little surprise. You can hear it for roughly 3/4 of the song. There's plenty to hear, but none of it is verbal. The vocals are simply a variety of whoops, shouts, and everything in between. In the beginning, it even sounds like there's an orangutan in the studio. While the whole thing is quite legendary among the fans, it's really just a vast musical wasteland. Usually I can only handle about 1/3 of it, but at the same time, I love what it does for Jandek's catalog. And that, my friends, is it for the second Jandek era. Interestingly enough, it started and finished with albums that were middle of the pack for their time. Lost Cause seems like one of those albums that knows how to impress me in the first half, yet it loses its way during one of the songs, Crack a Smile in this case. Of course, I'm not counting the electric end in that, because it serves its own purpose, and it's almost incomparable to the Jandek songs before it. Some say it has an equal in the third era, but we have a ways to go before it's time to confirm that. In the meantime, I just want to remind everyone how much fun I've had in the past 6 months since I posted the Rocks Crumble review. It's been an honor to share my thoughts on all this fascinating, bizarre, even beautiful music, and I can hardly contain my excitement as I turn another page on this project of mine, which is now the exact opposite of a lost cause.